I am 76 years old, and although I never thought I would become the kind of man who speaks to himself, lately I find myself talking out loud, just to fill the silence. My house, a modest single-story place with faded yellow siding and an uneven fence that I keep promising to repair, has grown so still that even the tick of the old wall clock feels like a living companion. I wake each morning earlier than I want, not because of any particular duty, but because age does not permit me the deep, careless sleep of youth. I lie there in the half-light, staring at the ceiling, listening to the emptiness around me, and I try to summon the memory of a time when the house hummed with other voices. I try to recall the sound of my wife's laughter drifting from the kitchen, or the scuffling feet of my daughter running late for school. Those sounds are gone, and what I have now is the echo of memory, a phantom household that no longer answers back. My mornings are ritualized almost to the point of obsession. I prepare tea the way my wife used to make it, a little stronger than is good for me, with 1 spoon of sugar stirred slowly so that the grains dissolve completely. I slice bread carefully, spread butter in an even layer, and sit at the table as though someone might still join me. I open the newspaper even though I already know its contents from the television the night before, and I look at the photographs as if they might distract me from the weight in my chest. There's a dignity in routine, or so I tell myself, though in truth it is not dignity I am clinging to, but the faint illusion that life has continuity, that one day is not merely a repetition of the last, but a meaningful step towards something. In my darker moods, I admit there is nothing ahead but decline, but habit allows me to keep that truth at bay. When you are old, people often speak to you with the tone they might use for a child, slow and oversweet, as if your ears have lost not just sharpness, but comprehension. I have not lost my comprehension, though at times I wish I could, because understanding too much is a burden. I notice how neighbors cross the street to avoid a long conversation, how the cashier at the market asks if I need help carrying my bag, even though I still can walk 2 miles unaided. How acquaintances I once worked with avert their eyes as if old. Age were a contagious disease. I spent 45 years as an accountant, keeping track of other people's money with precision and responsibility. Yet now I feel as if the sum of my life has been discounted to a fraction, as though the years I gave to work, to family, to duty, no longer have any currency. I speak of family, and that is the most bitter part. My wife, God rest her soul, has been gone these 11 years. She died suddenly, in her sleep, with no warning, and I like to think it was merciful for her, though it left me stranded. Her absence is not merely emotional, but physical. I still see her handwriting in the margins of recipe books, her scarves folded in the closet, the indentation on the pillow she once favored, faint but not yet vanished. Every object is a reminder. Our daughter, on the other hand, is very much alive, and yet her absence wounds me in ways even death does not. To lose a wife to nature's cruelty is tragic, but to lose a daughter to indifference is something harder to forgive. Her name is Margaret, though since her teenage years she has insisted everyone call her Maggie, as though cutting syllables from her name would cut her ties to the family she considered provincial. She was a bright child, ambitious, always looking beyond the horizon of this small, Midwestern town. When she left for college on the East Coast, I believed I was sending her into a larger world where she would thrive, and I was proud. I paid tuition bills without complaint, drove across states to deliver furniture for her dorm room, and cheered when she graduated with honors. But with every achievement, she moved a little farther from me, as though success required distance, as though remembering where she came from might slow her ascent. After her marriage to a man I never trusted, a man with sharp suits and a sharper smile, she all but erased me from the picture of her life. We live in the same city now, only 20 minutes apart by car, but the distance between us might as well be continents. Months go by without a visit, sometimes without a phone call. Birthdays are marked with text messages sent late in the evening, as if written in obligation rather than affection. When I do see her, it is usually because she needs something: help with a down payment, contribution to a tuition fund, a co-signature on some loan. I give what she asks, not because I am blind to her motives, but because she is my only child, and because I have not yet found the strength to sever even that tenuous bond. I tell myself that generosity is love, though in truth it has become a ransom. I pay for the illusion that she still cares. There is a peculiar humiliation in being tolerated rather than loved. I sit at my table some evenings, staring at the telephone, wondering whether to dial her number. More often than not, I do, and I rehearse what I might say if she actually answers. The calls usually go to voicemail, or if she does answer, she is brisk, distracted, already halfway out the door of the conversation. "I'll call you back, Dad," she says, and of course she never does. Each such call leaves me hollow, but still I try again the next week, because an ignored father is still a father, and the hope of hearing warmth in her voice is not something I can easily extinguish. I know how people view old men who complain of neglect. They say we exaggerate, that we expect too much, that we fail to understand how busy modern life is. Perhaps that is partly true. I do not demand that she sit by my bedside each evening, or that she make me the center of her life. I only wish for acknowledgement, for the occasional evening when we share a meal and talk not of money or obligations, but of memories and simple joys. I long to hear her laugh without irony, to see her eyes soften as they once did when she was a girl with braids and scuffed shoes. Yet those moments belong to the past, and the woman she has become looks at me as one might look at an old photograph, faded, embarrassing, better left tucked away in a drawer. Sometimes I walk to the park and watch other families. I see daughters holding their father's arms as they stroll, steadying them, listening with patience to stories they have probably heard 100 times. I see grandchildren climbing onto laps, demanding tales of the past, laughing at jokes that are more love than humor. I watch and I ache, because those simple acts that should be mine have been denied me, not by fate, but by choice. My daughter has chosen to keep her children away, claiming they are too busy with school or sports, and so they have grown into strangers whose birthdays I barely know. The few times I have seen them in recent years, they greeted me with politeness, but without recognition, as if I were a distant relative rather than the man who once cradled them as infants. The hardest part is that I still love her. Despite the coldness Despite the humiliations, despite the years of distance, I love her with the stubbornness of a father's heart. I remember the night she was born, the way her tiny fingers wrapped around mine as though she already knew who I was. I remember the first bicycle ride when she fell and scraped her knee, and I lifted her in my arms while she cried into my shirt. I remember school plays where she searched the audience for my face and smiled when she found it. I hold these memories as proof that what we once had was real, that my affection is not a delusion. And it is this love, paradoxically, that makes the neglect so cruel, because you cannot be wounded by someone you do not care for. So here I am, an old man, at the twilight of his days, clinging to the rituals of breakfast and newspaper, pretending the silence of the house is not suffocating. I tell myself that perhaps tomorrow she will call, that perhaps next week we will share dinner. Hope is the last refuge, they say, and though it often feels foolish, I cannot extinguish it entirely. Yet in my bones I sense a storm coming. A father knows when something is about to break. I feel it in the way her brief conversations have grown colder, in the way her laughter has acquired a sharpness, in the way she looks at me not with love but calculation. Something is approaching, and though I cannot yet name it, I know it will test me more than loneliness ever has. It was early autumn when the call finally came, a gray afternoon with the kind of sky that hangs low and presses on your chest, when the air is damp and filled with the smell of wet leaves. I had been sitting by the window with a book in my lap, though I had not read more than a page in the past hour, my mind drifting, as it often does, to the corners of memory, where I find fragments of my wife's voice or my daughter's laughter. As a child assistant, the ring of the telephone startled me, sharp and almost hostile in its intrusion. For a moment I hesitated, because I have learned by habit that calls rarely bring good news, and if it was my daughter's number, it usually meant some request or demand cloaked in civility. Still, I picked it up, and when I heard her voice, brisk and hurried as always, my heart betrayed me by leaping in my chest, like it used to when she was small and calling me Daddy from across the yard. She said she wanted me to come for dinner the following Saturday evening. Her tone was clipped, but not unfriendly, and she used the word family in a way that was almost ceremonial, as though the word itself could bridge the distance that had grown between us. I asked if there was a special occasion, and she paused long enough for me to know that she had not anticipated the question, then answered that she simply wanted us to spend some time together, that it had been too long. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to take her words at face value, to hear them as an offering of reconciliation, and not as the calculated courtesy they might have been. In that moment, with the quiet of the house pressing against me, I chose to believe, because belief is easier than the acknowledgement of indifference. I thanked her, perhaps too eagerly, and promised I would be there. She did not linger on the line. She had other matters to attend to, always other matters, and within a minute the call ended, leaving me with a strange mix of anticipation and dread. The days leading up to that dinner seemed longer than usual, each morning a step closer to something I could not clearly define but felt in my bones. I found myself rehearsing conversations as I shaved in the bathroom mirror, wondering whether I should bring up the loneliness, the absence, the long silence, or whether it would be wiser to pretend that nothing had happened, to accept her invitation with gratitude and avoid any mention of past neglect. I took out my old suit, the dark gray one that had accompanied me through weddings, funerals, and anniversaries. It no longer fit as it once had. My shoulders have narrowed with age, and the fabric sagged where it used to cling. But it was still the best I owned, and I pressed it carefully until the creases were sharp. I bought a modest bottle of wine from the local store, one I remembered my wife used to enjoy, and I wrapped it in a paper bag as though I were bringing an offering. I even shined my shoes, though I had not worn them in months, and as I bent over the leather, polishing in slow circles, I thought of how absurd it was that an old man should labor so hard for a single evening of recognition from his own child. On Saturday evening, as the sun set and the air grew colder, I stood before the mirror and tried to straighten my tie. My hands trembled more than I would have liked, and after several failed attempts, I gave up, letting the knot sit slightly crooked. I told myself she would not notice, or if she did, she would forgive it as the harmless imperfection of age. I left the house earlier than I needed to, walking slowly down the driveway, carrying the wine as carefully as if it were glass filled with memory rather than liquid. Her house was larger than mine, newer, with a wide porch and bright lights glowing in the windows, a symbol of the life she had built with her husband, the life in which I was only an occasional footnote. When I rang the bell, I felt like a guest rather than a father, as though I were intruding on a place that should by right have been open to me. She answered the door in a dress that spoke of careful preparation, her hair pulled back, her face painted with the kind of subtlety that suggested effort concealed behind apparent ease. She kissed me lightly on the cheek, a gesture so brief and mechanical it might have been given to a distant relative. Behind her, her husband appeared, tall and silent, his smile tight as if drawn with a ruler rather than with warmth. He shook my hand perfunctorily and stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled of roasted meat and spices, and from the dining room came the muffled sound of the children's laughter, though when I entered they fell quiet, greeting me with polite nods rather than the eager embraces I remembered from years ago. They have grown into adults almost without my knowledge, and their eyes, bright with youth, carried no trace of recognition of the man who once carried them on his shoulders. The table was set with more formality than I expected, silver polished, napkins folded in precise shapes, candles lit, though the electric light was more than sufficient. It felt less like a family dinner and more like a performance staged for unseen judges. I placed the wine on the table with a small smile, saying it was something I thought we all might enjoy. But my daughter's eyes flickered with something unreadable, and she pushed it aside with a murmur that they already had wine chosen for the evening. I took my seat, and though I tried to relax into the occasion, I could feel the tension in the air, a tension that grew with each passing minute, as the conversation turned not to reminiscence or affection, but to polite inquiries about my health, my finances, my memory. At first I answered simply, trying to keep the mood light, but the questions grew more pointed. Did I remember to take my medicine regularly? Did I ever forget to lock the door at night? Did I still handle my own bills, or did I need assistance? Each question was asked with the thin smile of concern, yet beneath it I sensed something sharper, a probing disguised as care. My daughter's husband leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his voice measured but insistent, as he recounted a story about an acquaintance's father who had wandered off one evening, confused, and been found hours later, miles from home. He spoke as though it were an amusing anecdote, but his eyes never left mine, and I understood that the story was a mirror they wanted me to see myself in. I laughed politely, though my hands tightened on the fork until my knuckles whitened, and I told them that I was perfectly capable, that I managed my affairs without difficulty. My daughter smiled in that patient, condescending way I have grown to dread, the smile that says she has already decided what is true, regardless of my words. The food was served, and though the flavors were rich, I could barely taste them, my appetite dulled by the undercurrent of judgment flowing across the table. I tried to steer the conversation toward lighter topics, asking the children about their studies, their interests, but their answers were brief, distracted, and my daughter quickly redirected the talk back to practical matters. I felt increasingly as though I were not there to share a meal, but to be evaluated, measured, perhaps even prepared for something. As the meal went on, the tone shifted from subtle to overt. My daughter remarked that it must be lonely living alone in that old house, that perhaps I should consider moving somewhere with more support. Her husband nodded solemnly, adding that many men my age struggled with independence, and that it was nothing to be ashamed of. The words stung, not because they were cruelly spoken, but because they were delivered with such calculated softness, as if I were a child being coaxed into surrendering a toy. I sipped my water slowly to disguise the heat rising in my chest, and I forced myself to remain calm, though a part of me wanted to rise from the table and shout that I was not yet dead, not yet useless, not yet theirs to manage like an estate. Waiting for probate. By the time dessert was served, I understood with a clarity that left me cold. This dinner was not a gesture of reconciliation, not a bridge toward closeness, but the opening act in a campaign. They had gathered me here not to honor me, but to probe my weaknesses, to remind me of my frailty, to begin planting in the minds of their children, and perhaps in mine, the idea that I was failing, that I was slipping, that decisions about my life might soon be better made by others. The realization sat in my stomach heavier than the food, a stone of dread, and though I smiled and thanked them as courtesy demanded, inside I felt something shifting, the first tremor of anger that would not be easily quieted. The evening had already taken on the weight of something staged rather than shared, and yet I still told myself to endure, to maintain composure, to look for a thread of warmth in the cold tapestry of the dinner. I remember staring at the plates as my daughter began serving the second course, her movements precise, her posture stiff, with the kind of control that leaves no room for tenderness. She placed the plate before me, a careful portion of roast and vegetables arranged as though she were serving a guest in a restaurant rather than a father at his own family table. I thanked her softly, but before I had lifted my fork, she leaned forward, and with a sudden flick of contempt that she disguised as jest, she spat into my food. For a heartbeat, the room was frozen, the children wide-eyed, her husband grinning with the kind of crooked satisfaction that makes one feel small, and I sat there stunned, my fork suspended in midair. She laughed, saying in a falsely playful tone that I always ate so slowly and that perhaps a little seasoning would not hurt. And though she pretended it was a joke, there was no humor in her eyes, only something sharper, something that cut me deeper than any blade could. I wanted to believe that I had misunderstood, that perhaps it was some grotesque attempt at humor. But the silence of the table told me otherwise. My grandchildren lowered their eyes, embarrassed not for her but for me, as if my humiliation were contagious, and they wanted no part of it. My son-in-law leaned back in his chair, smirking, whispering something to her that I could not hear, but that made her lips twitch in amusement. I stared at the plate, at the food now desecrated, and a flush of heat ran through my face, not only from shame, but from the realization that this was not an isolated cruelty, but a deliberate display, a public stripping of dignity meant to remind me of my place, to fix me in the role of the feeble old man whose protest would be met with ridicule. I pushed the plate slightly away, my hand trembling, and murmured that I was not hungry. But she insisted, pushing it back toward me with a firmness that carried more command than care. "Don't be dramatic, Dad," she said with a sharp smile. "It's good food. You should eat. You need your strength." Her husband chuckled, adding that I was always too sensitive, that old men often forgot how to laugh, and that maybe I should loosen up and take a joke. I felt the sting of tears at the corners of my eyes, not because I was fragile, but because the daughter I had once carried on my shoulders, the child I had fed with my own spoon, now looked at me as if I were something to be mocked. I forced the tears back, swallowing them like poison, because to let them fall would have been another victory for her. The conversation resumed as though nothing had happened, but the words that followed were no less cruel for their calm delivery. My daughter began recounting small incidents from the past months that I knew had never occurred, that I had forgotten where I left my keys and called her in a panic, that I had left the stove burning and nearly set fire to the house, that I had confused the names of my own grandchildren when she visited. Each story was delivered with a tone of weary patience, as if she were cataloging the decline of a once respected man, and her husband nodded along, confirming details, embellishing, creating a shared narrative in which I was already a caricature of senility. I sat listening, my fists clenched beneath the table, my jaw tight, because to protest would have been useless. I knew that in their eyes, denial would serve only as confirmation. What struck me most was the ease with which she lied, how naturally the falsehoods flowed from her lips, as though she had rehearsed them, as though they were not lies, but lines in a script she had written long before I arrived. The grandchildren listened in silence, absorbing each word, and I saw in their faces the beginning of doubt, the faint shadow of belief that maybe their grandfather truly was slipping. Maybe he truly was the confused old man their mother described. That realization hurt more than the spit on my plate, because it meant that she was not only stripping me of dignity in the present, but rewriting the past and poisoning the future, erasing the man I was and replacing him with an image of frailty and Incompetence. The rest of the meal blurred in my mind, my appetite gone, the food tasteless. I watched them laugh among themselves, exchanging glances that excluded me, and I felt as though I were no longer part of the family, but an intruder who had wandered into their home uninvited. Each laugh, each dismissive gesture, each fabricated story tightened the noose of humiliation around me, and though I sat silent, inside me a storm was gathering, a storm I knew I could no longer suppress for much longer. I excused myself finally, claiming I needed the restroom, though in truth I needed only to escape, to stand before the mirror and confront the reflection of a man who had allowed himself to be diminished in front of those who should have been his closest kin. In the bathroom, I stared at my face, at the sagging lines in the gray stubble, at the eyes clouded not by dementia, but by grief, and I whispered to my reflection that I was not broken, that I still remembered, that I still knew who I was. I thought of my wife, of the way she used to touch my cheek when I felt weak, and I felt a surge of anger, not only at my daughter, but at myself for sitting silently, for accepting humiliation like a beggar grateful for scraps. When I returned to the table, the laughter died for a moment, and I saw in their eyes that they had noticed the change, a small flicker of resistance in my posture, a stubborn refusal to crumble. But the night did not end there. Coffee was served, and as we sipped in strained silence, my daughter leaned across the table and in a voice smooth and practiced said that she had been thinking about my future, that she worried about me living alone, that it might be better if I entrusted certain responsibilities to her and her husband. She spoke of finances, of legal documents, of safety, and though she dressed her words in the language of care, I heard the steel beneath, the intent to seize control, to declare me incapable. Her husband nodded, adding that such arrangements were common, that many families made them for the good of their elders, and that I should not feel ashamed. I listened, outwardly calm, but inside I felt the walls closing in. The realization that this dinner had been a stage for the first act of a larger play, a play in which my role was to vanish quietly into dependence while they stepped forward as custodians of my life. I did not argue that evening. I thanked them for dinner, kissed my grandchildren lightly on the forehead, and allowed myself to be escorted to the door like a guest leaving a formal event. But as I walked down the steps into the cool night air, the wine bottle still unopened in my hand, I felt something hardening inside me. For years, I had endured their indifference, their distance, their requests for money disguised as affection. But this was different. To be humiliated at my own daughter's table, to have lies woven around me, to see the eyes of my grandchildren filled with doubt, was a wound deeper than silence. It was an assault on my very identity, a theft not of money, but of dignity. And as I walked slowly home, my breath fogging in the cold air, I knew that the storm gathering within me would soon break. And when it did, it would not be me who was left diminished. The following week passed in a haze of unease. Each day weighed down by the echo of that dinner, the spit on my plate, the lies that had been spoken so smoothly and accepted so easily. I could not rid myself of the image of my grandchildren's faces as they listened to their mother's stories, their expressions torn between politeness and the slow dawning of suspicion. It is one thing to be humiliated in private, but another altogether to be stripped of dignity in front of those who should carry your memory forward. I told myself I would not go back, that I would avoid further gatherings. Yet, when my daughter called again, her voice unnaturally sweet, promising another meal, this time quieter, more intimate, just the family, I found myself agreeing. Perhaps it was weakness, or perhaps it was that stubborn, foolish hope that never dies in a father's heart. The hope that maybe this time would be different, that maybe the cruelty had been a momentary lapse and not a permanent truth. On the evening of the second dinner, I prepared myself with less ceremony than before, for the enthusiasm of anticipation had been replaced by the caution of a man walking into an ambush he cannot avoid. I wore the same suit, but did not bother with the tie, and I carried no gift, for I had learned that offerings in that house were not received as tokens of love, but as inconveniences or burdens. When I arrived, I noticed at once the difference in atmosphere. The table was smaller, only 4 places set, the grandchildren absent, the candles unlit. My daughter greeted me with a smile that seemed forced, her husband hovering behind her with a look that was neither welcoming nor hostile, but something in between, a kind of watchful calculation. The meal was simpler this time. Stew and bread, the kind of food my wife used to make on cold evenings, and for a brief moment as I tasted it, I felt a pang of memory so strong that I nearly forgave everything. But the conversation soon pulled me back to reality, for it was not filled with warmth or stories of the past, but with subtle probing, questions about my finances, my routines, my habits. My daughter asked how much I still had in savings, whether I had considered what might happen if I became unable to manage my accounts, whether I had ever spoken with a lawyer about guardianship arrangements. Her husband leaned forward, his hands folded, his voice calm and measured, as he explained that such matters were common, that no one wanted to think about them, but everyone eventually must, and that it would be easier for all involved if I signed certain documents while I was still of sound mind. The phrase cut into me, for it carried within it the implication that I was already drifting toward the opposite. I looked at them both, their faces carefully arranged to convey concern, but beneath the mask I saw the hunger, the anticipation of power disguised as protection. I set my spoon down slowly, my hands steady now, and for the first time in many years, I felt the old clarity of the man I once was, the man who balanced columns of numbers with precision and who saw through falsehoods dressed as truth. I realized in that moment that the dinner was not an attempt to reconcile or even to humiliate. It was a step in a calculated plan to strip me not only of dignity, but of autonomy, to position me legally as incompetent so that they could take control of everything I had worked for. The realization did not come as a shock, but as a slow unfolding, a puzzle whose pieces I had been collecting without knowing. The lies told at the previous dinner, the stories of forgetfulness and confusion, the insistence on my frailty, the probing about my finances, It all aligned into a pattern too deliberate to ignore. They were building a case, constructing a narrative in which I was already half lost, preparing not just the children, but perhaps even the courts to see me as a man who could no longer be trusted with his own life. And the spit on the plate, the small humiliations, the laughter at my expense, those were not accidents, but rehearsals, a way to weaken me, to see if I would break. For a long moment I sat in silence, the stew cooling in my bowl, the ticking of the clock on the wall filling the space between us. I thought of my wife, of how she had trusted me to guard our daughter's future, of how she had believed that love, once given, would never curdle into betrayal. I thought of the house I lived in, filled with her handwriting and her memory, and I wondered what she would say if she could see the woman her daughter had become, if she would blame me for the distance or herself, or whether she would simply weep. My daughter mistook my silence for hesitation, for weakness, and she reached across the table, her hand brushing mine, her voice soft and coaxing as she said that this was only for my good, that I should not be afraid, that letting her and her husband take responsibility would free me from worry. I looked at her hand, at the manicured nails, at the skin that once clutched mine as a child when she was frightened, and I felt something shift inside me. I did not pull away, but I did not agree either. Instead, I smiled faintly, a smile that I knew must have unsettled her, and I said that I would think about it, that I would consider her words carefully, that she was right to be concerned. Relief flickered across her face, and her husband allowed himself the faintest smile of triumph, as though the trap had closed. But inside me another plan was forming, not born of panic, but of the cold clarity of a man who knows he is being hunted and who refuses to go quietly. That night, as I walked home, the air crisp and the moon sharp above the trees, I felt no despair. For the first time in years, I felt a strange energy, the stirring of resistance, the knowledge that though they might think me weak, though they might paint me as senile, my mind was still sharp enough to fight. I would not let them take what was mine, not my dignity, not my freedom, not the memory of the life I had built. The dinner that had begun as another act of humiliation ended instead as a revelation, a turning point. I saw their plan clearly, and I knew with equal clarity that I would not play the role they had written for me. The storm inside me had found its direction, and I would be ready when the time came. I did not sleep much after that second dinner, not because of fear exactly, but because something in me had finally snapped into alignment. The way a door that has long stuck in its frame will suddenly swing true when the hinges are reset, and in that, new clarity. I began to move through my days with a quiet purpose that surprised even me, making lists in my head as I shaved, rehearsing conversations as I walked to the market, deciding what I would say to whom and in what order, because if my daughter and her husband were building a case, then I would build one too, not of accusation or outrage, but of plain facts and sober documents that speak louder than tears ever could. And so the next morning, I phoned my physician and asked for a comprehensive evaluation, not the cursory tapping of a knee and a question about the day of the week, but a real battery of tests, memory, attention, executive function, along with blood work and imaging where indicated, and I told him in the steady tone that accountants use when reconciling numbers, that I required written results and a signed letter addressing my capacity to manage my own affairs, because sometimes the first step in defeating a lie is to place the truth on thick paper with a seal. While the appointments were being scheduled, I walked to the bank, not hunched and shuffling like a man begging for leniency, but upright and deliberate, and I asked to speak with a manager who knew me by name rather than position, and when I was shown into her office, I explained that I wished to place additional security on my accounts, to create alerts for unusual activity, to require in-person verification for transfers above a modest threshold, and I asked for printed histories of every login and attempted transaction in the past 6 months, including the IP addresses and locations, because I had an uneasy sense, no, a near certainty, that someone had already dipped a hand in waters not theirs. And if that hand belonged to my own blood then, I preferred to know it now rather than later. The manager listened with the grim sympathy of a woman who has seen too many families gutted not by poverty, but by greed, and she printed what I asked for, and together we flagged my profile in a way that would make silent alarms ring should anyone try again to move what is mine without my consent. From the bank, I walked to the office of a lawyer recommended by a neighbor, an older man with a careful manner, who wore his integrity like a well-brushed coat, and I told him plainly what I feared, not dressing it in melodrama, just the facts of the dinners and the probing questions and the stories that had begun to twist my life into a narrative convenient to others. And he nodded without surprise because, he said, the line between concern and control is often crossed in quiet rooms, with good intentions claimed like a passport. And then he laid out, with the precision I understood and respected, the instruments available to a man who wishes to remain the author of his own life. A durable power of attorney naming a professional fiduciary. Rather than family, a revocable trust for my accounts with a corporate trustee obligated by law rather than by sentiment. A medical directive that appoints a neutral advocate to interpret my wishes should I be unable to speak. And finally, a simple letter, notarized and dated, stating that no document purporting to transfer my property or rights to my daughter or her husband should be honored without verification directly from me in the presence of counsel. We prepared them all, and as the notary stamp thumped the paper, I felt an old confidence return, the feeling of numbers adding up. I wish I could say that these steps were unnecessary, that they represented an old man's paranoia, but within days the air filled with the metallic scent of a coming storm. A social worker appeared at my door unannounced, polite and apologetic, explaining that she had received a concerned report about my well-being, mentioning alleged episodes of confusion and neglect, and asking, with practiced gentleness, whether she might look around and speak with me. I invited her in. I showed her the list on my refrigerator of medications and dosages, the labeled pill organizer with each day snapped shut, the calendar with my appointments written in large, dark ink, the neatly stacked bills with checks already filled out, but not mailed until their due dates, and I handed her copies of the bank alerts and the letter from my physician scheduling evaluations, and I asked, not harshly, but directly, whether the report had named its source. She demurred, of course, but her eyes told me what. Her lips could not, and when she left, she squeezed my hand with the quick pressure of someone who knows she has been used, promising to note in her file that the allegations did not match the facts observed. That same week, my front door jammed at 2 a.m. under a heavy fist and the bright splash of a flashlight, and when I pulled a robe over my shoulders and opened it, I found 2 officers on the stoop explaining that a gas leak had been reported by a caller who feared I might be inside unconscious, and though their faces showed relief when no odor met their noses, the humiliation of standing in my own doorway half-dressed while strangers peered behind me into the quiet rooms settled on my skin like soot. I thanked them for their diligence, because the men were not my enemy, and after they left, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the telephone, understanding too well how small conspiracies are built. A welfare check here, a social worker there, and soon the file grows thick with concern until a judge who has never seen my eyes will sign a paper turning my life into a ward of convenience. I tell you this not to parade grievances, but to record the way motives bloom under pressure, because around that time I also began to hear things in the neighborhood, the way gossip travels on the same breeze that carries leaves across a lawn. And through a man I know from church who works in real estate, I learned that my daughter and her husband were in trouble, more complicated than pride would allow them to admit. A failed investment, a house too large and too expensively furnished, a line of credit stretched thin, and a contract her husband's firm had counted on that fell apart when a project was delayed, leaving them exposed to penalties and to whispers among his partners. Suddenly, their interest in my supposed frailty looked less like filial worry and more like a life raft woven hastily from legal papers and soft phrases. And though the knowledge did not ease the bruise on my heart, it gave shape to the hand that inflicted it, reminding me that greed is often fear in a more expensive suit. If I had been a different man, I might have marched to their door and shouted my findings. But I have learned that truth, to be effective, must be delivered not as a howl, but as a ledger, the entries clear and unassailable. So I kept my counsel and kept building the quiet fortress of documentation. I completed the cognitive evaluations with a focus that astonished the technician. I answered every question, slowly and fully, not to show off, but to leave no room for ambiguity. And when the report came back, stating in crisp paragraphs that I was of sound mind, with memory and judgment, consistent with age, but unimpaired, I made 3 certified copies and placed them with my lawyer, my bank, and my own file at home. I installed a small camera by my front door that recorded every visitor, not to spy but to remember. And I kept a journal in my own hand, dated and detailed, not because I needed to prove to myself that I existed, but because I intended to be ready if others attempted to prove the opposite. My daughter, sensing perhaps that the soft approach had not melted me, escalated with a smile. She invited me to a family talk at her house on a Sunday afternoon, promising it would be informal, just coffee and pastries, no fuss. When I arrived, I saw at once that the room was arranged like a quiet tribunal, her husband perched near a neat stack of folders on the sideboard, 2 chairs positioned to face a sofa as if for an interview, and on the coffee table a pen and a slim sheaf of papers clipped at the corner. She brought out a plate of scones and spoke lightly of the weather, then eased into the subject, as a surgeon might angle a scalpel, telling me they had drafted some temporary safeguards to relieve me of the burdens of paperwork and decision-making, stressing that nothing would change except that they would be authorized to help. And when I asked to read the documents myself, her husband looked offended, as though I had violated etiquette by wanting to know the contents of my own life, yet he slid them toward me with a tight smirk. I read every line slowly, while they watched with the poorly masked impatience of actors waiting for an audience to react at the correct moment. And what I found was not a gentle helper's toolkit, but a durable guardianship petition disguised as convenience language, pre-authorizing them to access my accounts, manage my care, and make decisions in the event of cognitive decline as determined by a qualified professional. A phrase that would have sounded reasonable if not for the attached form naming a specific clinician I had never met, later revealed to be a golfing partner of my son-in-law. I placed the papers back on the table and told them, in the same steady voice I had used years ago to explain audit variances to Jittery, clients, that my lawyer would review anything they wished me to sign, and that until then, nothing would be agreed. My daughter's smile tightened, then cracked, and I watched her weigh the options of cajolery and rage before choosing a third path. Tears, she cried with the fluency of someone who has practiced in mirrors, telling me that she was exhausted from worry, that every night she lay awake, imagining me collapsed on the kitchen floor, that she had only ever tried to do what was best. And while I sat there absorbing her performance, I noticed my son-in-law's eyes flick to the sideboard where the folders rested, and a corner of one protruded just enough for me to read the title, Petition, Temporary Guardianship, ex parte, with a date that suggested they had planned to file regardless of this conversation. I stood slowly, not to intimidate, but to break the posture of supplication the room arranged for me, and I told them that I appreciated their concern, but that my affairs were in order, that evaluations had been completed, that appropriate legal instruments were in place, and that any further attempts to misrepresent my condition would be met not with tears, but with the kind of attention that banks, lawyers, and courts give to words like fraud. I left before they could find another tactic, and as I walked home, the old ache pressed at my ribs, because there is no victory in telling one's own child that you do not trust her, even when trust has been treated like coin to be spent. Yet the ache did not weaken my resolve, and in the days that followed, the escalation continued from their side as well. Small arrows delivered from the shadows. A neighbor mentioned that my daughter had asked whether anyone had noticed me wandering at night. The pharmacist told me she had requested a list of my medications for safety, and a charity I had never donated to called to thank me for a pledge in an amount that mirrored too closely the round numbers my daughter has always favored. Each event by itself could be dismissed as error or miscommunication, but together they formed a constellation pointing in one direction, and I answered each calmly, correcting records, confirming boundaries, leaving a trail of dates and names like stepping stones across a dark river. Perhaps the most painful blow came quietly, as they often do. My elder grandchild, who has always been polite if distant, sent me a message late one night saying that his mother had shown him a video of an old man at a bus stop staring blankly at a timetable while traffic flowed around him, claiming it was me, proof of confusion. The boy did not accuse. He asked if I was all right, and the tenderness in his question cut deeper than any accusation could, because it told me he wanted to believe in me but had been given reason to doubt. I replied with a photograph taken by my doorbell camera that showed me at home at the time the video was recorded, and I attached a screenshot of the time-stamped bank alert for a transaction I had made that evening at the grocery store 2 blocks from my house. And then I wrote, with as much gentleness as I could put into a line of text, that sometimes people show us things to make us think what they need us to think. He did not respond that night, but the next day I found a folded note slipped under my doormat, unsigned but written in a hand I recognized, saying simply, "I'm sorry." By then the board was set and the pieces in motion, and I knew that the next move would not be mine, because I had structured my defenses and gathered my proofs, while they, having pushed soft pressure as far as it would go, would either retreat or attempt the bold stroke that pride demands when fear corners it. I did not need to wait long, because a week later an envelope arrived by certified mail containing a polite notice that a petition for temporary guardianship had indeed been filed, citing credible reports of cognitive decline and episodes of neglect, accompanied by 2 affidavits, one from a clinician whose name matched the attachment I had seen on their papers, and one from a neighbor I barely knew who claimed to have seen me wandering. And though the weight of such paper might crush a man unprepared, I read it with a strange calm, because I had expected it, and because on my kitchen table lay the counterweight, test results, bank logs, letters, dates, names, signatures, and a lawyer's card with a meeting already scheduled. That night I brewed tea the way my wife taught me, and sat by the window with the documents stacked into neat piles. And while the house around me held its gentle silence, I felt not the loneliness of a man besieged, but the steadiness of a man who has finally refused to surrender the ground beneath his own feet. And I thought of the dinner where my daughter spat on my plate, and of how small that act now seemed in comparison to the determination with which she had sought to devour my life. And I understood that humiliation had been the prologue, not the story. The story was this: a father, flawed and aging, choosing, not with bravado, but with quiet endurance, to be the author of his last chapters, and if there was any mercy left in the world, it would not be found in their approval, but in the clean, hard light of the truth arranged in order, waiting for the moment when it would be placed on the table in front of them, and whether they liked it or not, could no longer be swallowed without consequence. The day of the hearing arrived with a chill that seemed to settle into my bones long before I left the house. A gray morning where the light had no warmth and the air carried the smell of damp concrete. I dressed carefully, not in the sagging suit I had worn to their dinners, but in a newer jacket my wife had bought me years ago, and which I had worn sparingly, as though saving it for a day when dignity mattered most. I pressed it myself, every crease deliberate, because this was not simply a morning of paperwork and signatures. This was a morning where the story of my life, my competence, my very right to remain myself, would be weighed by strangers who had never eaten at my table or heard my voice tremble with love for my child. I placed the folder of documents into a leather briefcase I had not touched since retirement, and when I closed the clasp, the sound was sharp, final, as though sealing away not only evidence, but also the years of patience and humiliation that had led me here. The courthouse was crowded, the corridors filled with echoes of shoes and the low murmur of lives in limbo. And as I walked among them, I felt less like a man on trial than like a ghost wandering through a place where decisions are made about the living. My lawyer met me at the entrance, a calm hand on my shoulder, his voice steady, reminding me that facts speak louder than tears, that patience was stronger than outrage, and I nodded, though inside me the storm was already breaking. We entered the small courtroom, and there they were, my daughter and her husband, sitting straight-backed, their clothes immaculate, their faces arranged into the mask of concerned children burdened by duty. She looked at me only once, a fleeting glance that carried no warmth, only the nervous flicker of someone who knows the script but fears the improvisation of truth. The judge entered, a woman with sharp eyes that missed little, and the proceedings began. Their lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth as polished wood, presenting the narrative I had already come to know too well, that I was a man slipping into confusion, that I had been observed wandering, that I had neglected household safety, that I was at risk of financial exploitation, not from others, but from my own forgetfulness. He presented the affidavits, the clinician's report written by a man who had never sat across from me, and the words filled the air like smoke, cloying, difficult to breathe through. My daughter sat with her hands folded, occasionally dabbing her eyes with a tissue at the precise moments that would punctuate the story, and her husband leaned forward, nodding solemnly, the picture of reluctant responsibility. When it was our turn, my lawyer rose without theatrics and began to lay out the counterweight. He presented the certified evaluations from my physician and from the independent cognitive tests, read aloud their conclusions in clear clinical language, that my memory, reasoning, and judgment were intact, that I remained fully capable of managing my affairs. He submitted the bank records with security alerts, showing no irregularities except for attempted accesses traced to addresses not my own. He produced a letter from the social worker who had visited unannounced, describing a home orderly, safe, and maintained with care. Each document was not a flourish, but a stone, laid carefully to build a wall against the storm of lies, and as the pile grew, I saw the judge's eyes shift, saw the smoke begin to thin. Then came the moment I had both dreaded and prepared for, the chance to speak for myself. The judge turned to me, her gaze steady, and asked if I wished to make a statement. I rose slowly, gripping the edge of the table, not for support, but to steady the anger that threatened to spill from me. I spoke not as a supplicant, but as a man giving account of his own life. I told her of my work, of the years I balanced ledgers with precision, of how the same clarity now governed my days. I told her of the routines I maintained, the calendars I kept, the simple evidence of a mind that still held itself in order. I described the visits, the dinners, the humiliation, not with the bitterness of complaint, but with the plain tone of fact, because the truth, when spoken simply, is its own defense. And then, though my throat tightened, I told her what hurt most, that it was my own daughter who had brought me here, not out of love, but out of convenience, not out of duty, but out of fear of her own failures, and that though I could forgive, neglect, what I could not accept, was the theft of my dignity while I still breathed. The room was silent when I finished. My daughter's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, and for the first time I saw her mask falter, her eyes glistening not with rehearsed tears, but with something raw, whether fear or shame I could not yet tell. The judge leaned forward, her fingers steepled, and asked me one last question: why I had not confronted my daughter directly, why I had not simply spoken to her outside of this chamber. I answered that a father will endure many things in silence, that love makes us swallow insults and wait for kindness that never comes, but that there comes a point when silence is no longer patience, but complicity, and that I had reached that point. The night she spat in my food and laughed while her children looked away. It was the only moment in the hearing when her composure broke completely. She gasped softly, and her husband placed a hand on her arm as if to steady her. But the gesture looked more like control than comfort. The judge made her notes, her expression unreadable, and then she adjourned briefly to review the materials. The room exhaled as she left, my lawyer leaning close to whisper that we had done what was necessary, that the evidence was clear, but I felt little triumph, only the weight of years pressing against my chest. When the judge returned, her ruling was concise. The petition for guardianship was denied, the affidavits noted as inconsistent, the clinician's report disregarded due to lack of direct evaluation. She confirmed my competence formally, entering it into the record, and cautioned against further frivolous petitions, noting that abuse of such proceedings for personal gain could itself invite legal scrutiny. The gavel struck once, a sound that echoed like a bell, and just like that, the threat that had hovered over me was dispersed. But victory did not feel sweet. As I gathered my papers and rose, I looked across the table at my daughter, and what I saw was not triumph or defeat, but a chasm where love had once lived. Her face was pale, her eyes downcast, her husband already whispering urgently into her ear, and I realized that though I had defended my freedom, something deeper had been lost, something no court could restore. I walked out of the room slowly, my briefcase heavy at my side, my steps measured, because I knew that though the battle had ended, the wound of betrayal would not close easily, and the house I returned to that night would be quieter than ever, filled not with memory alone, but with the echo of a daughter's voice turned against her father. After the ruling, I walked home through a wind that smelled of rain and metal, feeling in my bones the odd mixture of relief and sorrow that follows a battle won at the price of something irreplaceable. And once inside, I set the briefcase on the table and opened every window, letting the courthouse air out of the rooms, then brewed tea the way my wife taught me, and sat with the cup between my palms until the steam faded and the quiet returned to its familiar shape. That evening, I did not celebrate. I did not phone anyone. I simply took each document from the folder and slid it into the drawer where my will and letters already lived. And then I added 2 more pages I had written the night before, one addressed to my daughter and one to her children, both of them plain and undecorated, the first establishing boundaries with the steadiness of a fence post sunk deep into good ground. The second offering love without conspiracy and memory, without accusation, because I had decided that if there was to be any future between us, it would stand on truth spoken in daylight, or it would not stand at all. In the days that followed, I enacted a quiet reshaping of my life that felt less like running away and more like finally choosing the house I would die in and the road I would walk to reach it. So I met with my lawyer again, and we moved my accounts into the trust with a corporate trustee who would answer to law rather than to sentiment, and we finalized the medical directive that placed decisions in the hands of a neutral advocate recommended by my doctor. Then I visited the bank manager with a tin of butter cookies and a typed letter requesting that all inquiries about my finances from family be recorded and declined unless I appeared in person. And she, who has seen too many fathers step into her office with eyes bewildered by betrayal, shook my hand with a promise to stand watch. I cleaned the house room by room, not with the despair of a man tidying for absence, but with the care of a man preparing for a smaller, truer life, thinning closets, boxing up items to donate, choosing what to keep, not by price, but by pulse. My wife's recipe cards with flour still ground into the edges. The plastic pony my daughter used to sleep with clutched under her chin. The photograph of us 3 on the day Maggie learned to ride a bicycle and looked at the camera with a mouth full of missing teeth in triumph. A picture I set on the mantel like a candle, whose wick still remembers fire. My daughter called twice, each time leaving a message that swung like a gate from apology to accusation and back again. And then she sent a long email that read like a brief, part sorrow and part negotiation, offering visits under certain conditions and insisting that her concerns had always been pure, which I answered with a letter I printed and mailed, because paper slows the hand and clarifies the mind. I wrote that I was willing to meet her in a public place with a third party. Present that I would not discuss my finances except to say they were settled. That if she wished to repair what she had damaged, she could begin by acknowledging the truth not only to me, but to her children, and that there would be no path across the distance she had made that did not pass through confession, restitution, and time. I did not use the word forgiveness, because I have learned that forgiveness offered too quickly becomes a broom that sweeps the dirt under the bed to be tripped over. Later, but I did write that my door, though closed, was not locked from the inside. It was not she who appeared first, but my grandson, lanky and unsure, standing on the porch with his hands in his pockets like a boy who has lost something and is not yet ready to name it. And I invited him in and poured him the tea he would not drink. And we talked in the long, circling way men talk when around the heart there is barbed wire. And eventually he told me he had believed what he was shown, because sons believe their mothers until they are given reason not to. And I said that I understood that I had once believed his mother would never turn away from her own father. And that belief is a beautiful servant and a terrible master. He did not defend her. He did not condemn her either. He only asked whether I might ever sit with them again, all of us at one table. And I told him that tables are sacred, that a table can heal or it can wound, and that if he and his sister ever wished to share mine, there would always be a plate set for them, but that I would not sit where I was, made a spectacle. And he nodded, and before he left, he placed on the mantel the little metal whistle I used to keep in my pocket when I took them to the park, a talisman I had thought long lost, saying he'd found it in a drawer at their house, and thought it belonged here. I began to move differently through my days, not faster. Age does not permit miracles, but with a lengthening stride that felt like ownership of the ground beneath me, joining the Tuesday volunteers at the church food pantry where I carried crates and sorted cans and learned the names of people whose stories were heavy and whose gratitude was light, signing up at the library to help with the Wednesday math hour, where I sat with nervous teenagers and ran a pencil down fractions while their shoulders slowly loosened, taking the long way home by the lake where geese left their quills like stray commas along the shore, then cooking one honest meal each evening and laying the table for one with the care due a guest who matters. I slept more soundly because fear prowls when a man is uncertain, and now I had put locks on the right doors and opened the others toward air and sun. Only once did my daughter come to the house, arriving without warning on a day of bruised clouds, and I stepped outside to meet her on the porch so that my rooms would not inhale the storm, and we stood with the rail between us while she talked quickly about misunderstandings and intentions and appearances, words beaten thin by use, and I listened without interrupting until she said she could not be expected to humiliate herself in front of her children just to satisfy my pride. I told her it was not my pride that required truth, but their future, because children raised on performances grow into adults who mistake manipulation for love, and if she wanted them to walk straighter than we had, she would have to bend first. She stared at me with eyes that for a flicker resembled the child I had lifted from a bicycle after a fall, then hardened, and she left with a sentence that tried to wound and only confirmed what I already knew, that she was not ready to choose truth over comfort. Not yet. I do not pretend that any of this has made me young or invulnerable, and there are evenings when the house presses close, and I speak aloud to the empty rooms, telling my wife what I have done and what I have left undone, and I do not hide from myself that I will die sooner than later, likely in this chair by the window, with the late light on my hands, But I have set the table of my last years with intention and honesty, and that is no small mercy. On Sundays, I place 3 plates in the cupboard. Within easy reach, 1 for me and 2 for the grandchildren, should they come by unannounced. And sometimes I imagine a day when my daughter will step through the gate without a lawyer in her mouth and sit across from me in the quiet that follows. Confession. And we will eat what is placed in front of us with gratitude rather than calculation. Yet even if that day never arrives, I have made peace with the shape of what remains, because dignity, once retrieved, tastes like bread after hunger. I know now that the dinner where she spat on my plate was not merely an insult, but a prophecy, for she did not understand that a man who has learned to swallow grief will not swallow lies forever. And when the truth finally rose to the surface, all sharp bone and shining spine, it caught in the throat of those who had mistaken patience for weakness and silence for consent. I live quietly. I pay my bills on time. I keep my papers in order and my shoes by the door. And when I set my place each evening, I think of the difference between being fed and being respected. And I whisper a grace that is not a prayer for their change so much as thanks for my own. Because in the end, the meal I needed was not their approval, but my own courage. And though she once spit into my supper as if to brand me with shame, it was she who choked on what could not be swallowed, while I, old, ordinary, unremarkable, finished what was mine and rose from the table still myself.